Sex addiction. So what is sex addiction? Sex addiction, also known as hypersexuality or excessive lust or limerence or romantic infatuation. It's not really a new phenomenon. It's probably since the 1980s that the term sex addiction or porn addiction has been widely used, particularly in the West, following Dr. Robert Carney's book, Out of the Shadows. But prior to that, in ancient cultures, whether it's ancient Greece, ancient Romans, Arab Muslims, they did refer to, but they didn't call it sex addiction, but they did refer to people who were struggling with excessive lust, shall we call it? But in recent times, people generally refer to this problem where someone has excessive lust as sex addiction. There is some controversy, well, there is some dispute amongst medical health professionals and psychologists whether sex addiction is a mental disorder. At the moment, it's not included in the DSM of like mental health disorders. But what is included is compulsive sexual behavior, so CSB, which is like another name for sex addiction. But addiction in and of itself is not included. So there is some debate in terms of whether sex addiction does exist, and by sex addiction, I'm referring, or it generally refers to any form of sexual behavior that feels out of control, and generally that would be over a period of maybe like 6 months or maybe a year, and where it has detrimental impact to the person's life. It's not necessarily measured by, like for example, it could be in the form of excessive masturbation, excessive watching of pornography, visiting prostitutes and sex workers, womanizing, visiting strip clubs. So there's different forms of sex addiction. It's not just related to um, porn addiction, for example, or having casual sexual partners. And the one is not diagnosed by necessarily how frequent someone has, like how frequent one masturbates or has or watches porn. Again, it's where it's quite a subjective it's quite a subjective diagnosis, and that's why some people unfortunately will even use it to justify, not to justify, yeah, to kind of like justify bad behavior. You do often find that maybe some men who've maybe been caught committing or having an affair, that they can then say I've got a addiction, or especially there's been a number of celebrities who've been accused or caught of sexual harassment, and then they'll pull the mental health card and say, they've got a sex addiction. So that's why it's not clear as of yet in terms of um what actually constitutes sex addiction, because again, it's quite a generic definition in terms of any sexual behavior that feels out of control, because that can vary from person to person, and how one diagnoses that can also vary from one psychologist and sex therapist to another. So it's important that one is aware of that, especially for the women. If your partner, if he says he has a porn addiction problem or a sex addiction problem, it may be a case of he just lacks self-restraint and sexual discipline, and he needs to develop that, and there's different things he can do in order to develop that. So, but I use the term loosely, and I use the term sex addiction because it's commonly used nowadays, and everyone, when you say sex addiction, they kind of think that or they know what you're talking about. Whereas if you were to say compulsive sexual behavior, again, a lot of people wouldn't necessarily know what you was talking about. So that being said, brief introduction to what sex addiction is, and how it's understood by medical practitioners and mental health practitioners. And now let's get into the recommendations for recommendations for women whose partners are struggling with sex addiction or porn addiction. So these are the 5 books that I would recommend. The 5 books I recommend for partners, for women in particular, who their husbands, their partners are struggling with sex or porn addiction. The first book is called Sex Addiction: The Partner's Perspective, written by Paula Hall, who is a UK leading sex addiction specialist, and she's also author of another book called Understanding and Treating Sex Addiction. This is an excellent book. So in this book, it's basically, this book is targeted at partners of sex addiction, whether it's a man whose partner is female partner is a sex addict, or a woman whose male partner is a sex addict. Really excellent book. Also has a guide and some tips in order to help the person understand the reality of sex addiction, because there is a lot of stigma towards sex addiction. but based on her research, Paul does talk about that is quite prevalent nowadays. So she talks about whether sex addiction does exist, and she explains helping people, especially someone who is not a sex addict, understand the sex addiction phenomenon and why many partners feel hurt by sex addiction because of the betrayal that's involved. And then she goes on. So the book is split into three parts, I believe. Yeah, so part one is the reality of facing the reality of sex addiction. The second is caring for the partner's need, and the third is the couple relationship make or break. So she then gives some advice in terms of how couples can heal from sex addiction and overcome this problem. So this is a really excellent book. She's also developed it's a very practical book with again good advice. She developed I think it's called the recovery model or the choice model, where she helps anyone who's struggling with sex addiction, how they can overcome it with a step-by-step guide. I think that's in the other book, but this is definitely an excellent companion if your partner is struggling with sex addiction. So again, definitely highly recommend this book. It's a very, very comprehensive book. The second book, He's Porn, Her Pain. Second book is He's Porn, Her Pain. And this is it's an excellent book written by Marty Klein. So Marty Klein is an American, I think he's a psychotherapist, I believe, but he's written a number of books. It's an excellent book. He's Porn, Her Pain, Confronting America's Porn Panic with Honest Talk About Sex. So really good book, well researched. He looks at um and he looks at like the kind of notion that especially some of the reservations that people have towards porn, and how a lot of people are quick to kind of say that someone has got a porn problem, where he kind of debates that, and he kind of like argues against the sex addiction and porn addiction label. And I don't think he's a big fan of that, but it's thought provoking book. It's packed with research, and it's split into three parts again. Looking at understanding the context in terms of how porn became mainstream in American culture. The second part looks at some of the myths around porn and porn in popular culture, and investigating. He explores, whether porn does actually demean women and things like that, and then he looks at the third part of the book in terms of porn and porn's relationship with um, the person themselves and their partner, and how porn can or is perceived to affect relationships, children, and how it can affect consumers. So it's a really interesting book. He's Porn, Her Pain, Confronting America's Porn Pandemic with Honest Talk About Sex. So yeah, really good book. Like I said, He's Porn, Her Pain. Sorry, that's the second book I would recommend. The third book, Mending a Shattered Heart. Mending a Shattered Heart by Stefanie Carnes, who is a licensed marriage and family therapist based in the US of A. And her area of expertise includes working with parents and families struggling with multiple addictions, such as sex addiction, eating disorders, and chemical dependency. She's also a certified sex addiction therapist and supervisor. So this is a really good book. It's a book again targeting at people who their partners are struggling with sex addiction. I think she actually might be related to um let me check. She might actually be related to Robert Carnes, who developed the sex addiction term, or who popularized it. Let me just check that. Yeah, I just checked. Sorry, it's not Robert Carnes, it's Patrick Carnes. So Stephanie Carnes is the daughter of Patrick Carnes, who wrote the book Out of the Shadows, which is a groundbreaking book on sex addiction. So yeah, so Stephanie Carnes, yeah, so she's helping furthering her father's legacy. So she is the daughter of Dr. Patrick Carnes, who wrote a pioneering and groundbreaking book on sex addiction. So, but yeah, coming to this book itself, it's a really good book because it talks about how a woman can feel betrayed when when her partner has a sex addiction problem, and she gives a lot of She composes a number of. Oh, she actually quotes her father. She composes a number of blah, blah, blah. Yeah. So what this book does, which is really good, she brings together a number of professionals who work in the sex addiction field, and they've written different essays. I think there's about 14 in total, 14 chapters, bringing their expertise in terms of, investigating or giving general advice in terms of understanding what is sex addiction, whether one should stay or one should go, setting the boundaries, understanding what sex addiction means for them and their partners. What should they tell their kids? How does sex addiction affect certain relationships? So again, it's really interesting, well researched read. So Mending a Shattered Heart, Stefanie Carnes, who brings together a number of sex addiction professionals and pioneers in terms of helping women or partners who their partner has a sex addiction problem. So that is another book. That's the third book. The fourth book, Your Sexually Addicted Spouse. Your Sexually Addicted Spouse, How Partners Can Cope and Heal. And this is co-authored by Barbara Steffens and by Marsha Means. So this is a book that's co-authored by Barbara Steffens and Marsha Means. So this is a book, again, split into three parts. A lot of these books seems to be split into three parts. The first part deals with when your partner's sex addiction shatters your world and understanding trauma and post-traumatic trauma. Then it gives some advice about that, and then some advice about the journey to healing, and becoming whole. And then the third part of the book is overcoming the trauma's impact and how basically how one can live their lives and maybe with their partners or without their partners who are suffering from sex addiction. So this is a really interesting book on sex addiction, and it helps. This is a book about hope and helps pave the way for restoring the relationships. It's really a seminal work and a game changer. It's really good for sex educators as well as and professionals as well, to help understand impact of sex addiction and how it can affect relationships as well. So this is a good book again for professionals as well as individuals who want to understand more about sex addiction and how they can overcome, trauma that they may be facing, um, and whether they want to rekindle their relationship. So the last book, the fifth book, is called The Porn Trap. So the fifth book is called The Porn Trap: The Essential Guide to Overcoming Problems Caused by Pornography. So this is co-authored by a married couple, Wendy Maltz and Larry Maltz. It's a book that aims to eradicate the stigma towards porn addiction and help couples, again, especially if obviously one of the couples has a porn addiction problem, how they can become aware of it and how they can heal. The book is split into two parts. The first part deals with the power of porn and the porn relationship and partners in pain, and then the second part. So the first part is about becoming aware of pornography and the porn problem. And then the second part is about healing and how one can get motivated to quit porn. They give six steps in order to overcome porn and how the couple can heal together, and adopt a new approach towards sex. So that's really good book. Again, it's well researched. It's got a lot of advice actually, and it's based on, I think, a lot of their researchers as counselors and sex experts. So, and they also wrote another sexual recovery book called The Sexual Healing Journey. Um, Really comprehensive book. So The Porn Trap by Wendy and Larry Maltz. That's another good book. It will help you decide whether it's time to quit porn and how to stop using porn and improve one's self-esteem, and also to heal an intimate relationship and develop a healthy sex life post porn. So really, really good book, The Porn Trap. So they're the five books I would recommend, especially for women who their partners are struggling with porn. Again, it could also be the case for men who there may be their female partners, their wives are struggling with porn. So they're the five books I wanted to highlight.